The forest breathed around him like a living cathedral, pulsing with colors no human eye was meant to witness. Thomas Graves stood frozen at the threshold between two worlds, the one he'd known all his 32 years, and the one that had just claimed him with fangs and fire. Ruby light emanated from bioluminescent flora that carpeted the forest floor, their glow intensifying and dimming in rhythmic waves that matched the thundering of his heart. Crimson moss clung to ancient tree trunks, releasing spores that drifted through the air like embers from an invisible flame. The canopy above formed a vaulted ceiling of intertwined branches, through which moonlight filtered in silver ribbons, creating a chiaroscuro effect that would have been beautiful if Thomas weren't fighting for his sanity. His hand pressed against his neck, fingers trembling as they traced the twin puncture wounds that still wept a mixture of blood and something else, something that glowed faintly in the darkness, a luminescence that pulsed in time with his racing pulse. The venom. He could feel it coursing through his veins, a liquid heat that both burned and soothed, transforming him from the inside out. Every nerve ending sang with hypersensitivity. He could hear the whisper of wind through individual leaves, smell the mineral composition of the soil beneath his boots, taste the copper of his own blood on his tongue. The world had become overwhelming in its intensity, as if someone had turned reality's volume to maximum and shattered the dial. His brown shirt clung to his torso, soaked with the cold sweat of transformation. His blue jeans were torn at the knees from when he'd fallen. Was it an hour ago? A day? Time had become elastic in this place, stretching and compressing in ways that defied natural law. He'd come to these woods as a skeptic, a researcher armed with cameras and scientific instruments, determined to debunk the local legends of the Red Forest and its supposed supernatural inhabitant. Now those cameras lay scattered and broken somewhere in the darkness behind him, their lenses shattered, their memory cards corrupted by energies they weren't designed to capture. She stood before him now, the creature, no, the woman, who had brought him to this precipice. Calling her merely beautiful would be like calling the ocean merely wet, a catastrophic understatement that failed to capture the totality of her presence. She was approximately 6 feet tall, with a physique that combined predatory grace with devastating femininity. Her skin possessed the luminous quality of moonlight on marble, pale and flawless, almost glowing with its own internal radiance. It was the pallor not of death, but of something that had transcended the need for mundane life, something that had evolved beyond such primitive requirements as sunlight and warmth. Her hair cascaded past her shoulders in waves of deep crimson, not the artificial red of human dye but the rich, complex hue of arterial blood mixed with fire. Each strand seemed to possess its own subtle movement, responding to currents of air that Thomas couldn't feel, creating a corona effect around her head that was both angelic and demonic. Her face was a study in contrasts, delicate features that spoke of aristocratic breeding, high cheekbones that could cut glass, a jawline that balanced strength with elegance. Her lips were full and the color of wine-dark roses, currently curved in an expression that hovered somewhere between amusement and hunger. But it was her eyes that truly captured him, that held him pinned as surely as any physical restraint. They glowed with an inner fire, scarlet irises that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of crimson and gold, pupils that dilated and contracted like a cat's, responding to stimuli Thomas couldn't perceive. When she looked at him, and she was looking at him now with an intensity that made his breath catch, he felt simultaneously seen and consumed, as if those eyes could peer through flesh and bone to examine the very essence of his soul. There was ancient intelligence in those eyes, a consciousness that had witnessed centuries pass like seasons, accumulating knowledge and power that no human mind could fully comprehend. Her body was encased in armor that seemed to have been grown rather than forged, organic material that hugged her curves like a second skin. It was black as the void between stars, but threaded throughout with veins of pulsing crimson energy that branched across her torso, arms, and legs like a circulatory system made visible. The armor covered her modesty while accentuating every dangerous curve, the swell of her breasts, the narrow taper of her waist, the powerful muscles of her thighs. It wasn't mere protection, it was a statement of identity, a physical manifestation of the dark power that animated her. But most magnificent, and most terrifying, were her wings. They rose from her shoulder blades, each one spanning at least 12 feet from base to tip, constructed of the same organic material as her armor but more delicate, more intricate. The membrane stretched between bone-like struts was translucent, revealing patterns of crimson energy that flowed through them like blood through capillaries. When she moved, the wings shifted slightly, maintaining balance, and Thomas could see how they caught the ambient light, refracting it into subtle spectrum displays that painted the surrounding forest in shifting hues. They marked her as something that had conquered gravity itself, something that could take to the skies like the ancient dragons of mythology. She was taking a step toward him now, one hand rising with deliberate slowness, fingers extending toward his face with predatory grace. Her nails were long and elegant, shaped into points that could probably pierce flesh as easily as her fangs had. Those fangs were visible as her lips parted slightly, two elongated canines that gleamed like polished ivory in the ruby light. They were the instruments of her power, the tools by which she had marked him, claimed him, bound him to whatever fate she had planned. "You survived," she said, her voice a contralto that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity, bypassing his ears to speak directly to his nervous system. There was a faint accent to her words, something ancient and Eastern European, though filtered through so many centuries that it had become unique, belonging to no living culture. "Remarkable. Do you understand how rare that is, Thomas Graves? 1 in 10,000 who receive my venom live through the transformation. 1 in 10,000 possess the strength of will and purity of essence to withstand the remaking." He wanted to step back, to put distance between himself and this impossible being, but his body refused to obey. Whether from the venom's paralytic properties or from some deeper compulsion, he remained rooted in place, his muscles locked in position. His voice, when he found it, came out as a ragged whisper. What did you do to me?" Her lips curved into a fuller smile, revealing more of those deadly fangs. Her hand continued its approach, and he could feel the heat radiating from her palm before it made contact. When her fingers brushed his cheek, it was like being touched by living electricity, every nerve in his face firing simultaneously. His vision blurred and refocused, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw double, his own perception overlaid with hers, seeing himself through her eyes as something precious and necessary. "I've given you a gift," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw with possessive tenderness. "And a curse. They are inseparable, the blessing and the burden. My venom now flows through your veins, rewriting your biology at the cellular level. You are no longer entirely human, Thomas, but neither are you vampire. You are something between, something new. A bridge between two species." His mind reeled at the implications. The scientist in him, the part that still functioned despite the sensory overload and existential terror, began cataloging the changes he could feel. Enhanced strength. When he'd instinctively grabbed a branch during his earlier flight through the forest, he'd crushed it to splinters. Heightened senses. He could hear her heartbeat now, a slow steady rhythm that pulsed perhaps once every 5 seconds, so different from his own racing cadence. Altered perception. The world had gained layers of depth and meaning he'd never noticed before, as if a veil had been lifted from reality itself. Why? The question burst from him with more force than he'd intended, his free hand clenching into a fist at his side. "Why me? I'm nobody. Just a researcher, a failed academic chasing folklore. Why would you choose me for this transformation?" She stepped closer, eliminating the remaining distance between them until he could feel the unnatural coolness of her body displacing the warm night air. Her wings shifted, curling slightly forward, creating a cocoon around them both that shut out the rest of the forest. Her other hand rose to mirror the first, cradling his face between her palms as she tilted his head back, forcing him to meet those incandescent eyes. "Choice implies randomness," she said softly, each word weighted with significance. "There was no randomness in this, no chance or coincidence. I have walked this earth for 743 years, Thomas Graves. In that time, I have encountered thousands of humans, hundreds of thousands. I have watched your species multiply and spread, observed your triumphs and your failures. And in all that time, I have never found one suitable for the bond. Not until you stumbled into my forest with your instruments and your skepticism, your brilliant mind and your wounded heart." The last word struck something deep inside him, touching on pain he thought he'd buried. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, his wife unable to cope with his obsession with the unexplained, his constant traveling to remote locations chasing stories that never quite panned out. The university had let him go 2 years back when his research failed to produce publishable results. He'd been drifting since then, living off savings and small grants, slowly surrendering to the reality that his life's work might amount to nothing. He'd come to this forest in Romania as a last-ditch effort, following local legends of a vampire queen who supposedly ruled the Red Forest, expecting to find nothing but tourist tales and natural bioluminescence with a prosaic explanation. Instead, he'd found her. Or she'd found him. "I don't understand," he managed, though his voice was weakening, the intensity of her proximity draining his capacity for resistance. "What bond? What are you talking about?" Her expression shifted, losing some of its predatory edge, revealing something underneath that might have been loneliness. For just a moment, the ancient creature before him seemed almost vulnerable, a glimpse of the woman she must have been before her transformation, before centuries of solitude had forged her into this apex predator. "Vampires are not meant to exist alone," she said, and there was a weight of sorrow in her voice that spoke of long years endured in isolation. "We are transformed from humans, yes, but we retain certain needs, certain drives that define us. Among those is the need for connection, for a mate who can stand beside us, share our power, anchor us to something beyond mere survival. Most of my kind find such mates among other vampires, but that path was closed to me long ago." She paused, her thumbs stroking his cheekbones in a gesture that was almost tender, at odds with her fearsome appearance. "I was made against my will, Thomas, turned by a creature who sought to control me, to make me his consort. I destroyed him within hours of my transformation, but his death left me without a sire's guidance, without entry into vampire society. I became an outcast, too dangerous to approach, too powerful to destroy. For over 7 centuries, I have ruled this forest alone, sustained by animal blood and the rare foolish human who ventured too deep into my domain. And for over 7 centuries, I have searched for someone who could survive my venom, who could become what you are now becoming. A mate bonded to me by blood and power, capable of standing at my side without being destroyed by my nature." The implications of her words settled over Thomas like a physical weight. Mate. She wanted him as a mate. The clinical part of his brain noted that this explained certain aspects of vampire folklore he'd studied, the emphasis on vampire brides and consorts, the romanticization of the vampire's bite, the notion of eternal devotion. But the emotional part of him, the part that was still reeling from the attack and transformation, struggled to process the sheer impossibility of the situation. "You can't just decide that," he protested, finding some core of defiance despite his weakened state. "I'm not some prize to be claimed. I have free will. I have a choice in this." Her eyes flashed with something that might have been approval. "Yes," she agreed, surprising him. "Yes, you do have a choice. The venom has transformed you, but it has not enslaved you. You could walk away from this forest, return to your human life, try to live with the changes I've wrought in you. You would struggle, certainly, your enhanced abilities would make normal human existence difficult, and you would find yourself drawn back here, to me, with increasing intensity. But you could resist. You could choose solitude and slow madness over what I'm offering." "And what exactly are you offering?" Thomas asked, trying to ignore the way his body was responding to her proximity, the way the venom in his blood seemed to sing in harmony with her presence. She leaned forward, bringing her lips close to his ear, her breath cool against his skin. "Partnership. Power. A purpose beyond the mundane existence you've been slowly dying in. You came to this forest seeking proof of the supernatural, Thomas Graves. I'm offering you the chance to not just study it, but to become it. To stand beside me as the guardian of this place, to help me maintain the balance between the human world and the old dark things that still lurk in forgotten corners of the earth. To explore the mysteries you've spent your life chasing, not as an outsider with cameras and instruments, but as a being who has transcended the limitations of mortal flesh." Her hand slid from his face down to his neck, fingers tracing the bite marks with possessive gentleness. "And yes," she continued, her voice dropping to a purr that vibrated through his bones, "to be my mate. To share my bed and my power, to stand as my equal in the darkness, to father the child I have been unable to conceive in 7 centuries of isolation. The venom has made you compatible with my biology, Thomas. You are now the only human on Earth who could give me what I have been denied: continuity, legacy, family." The enormity of it staggered him. She wasn't just asking him to stay with her, to accept his transformation. She was asking him to rebuild his entire life around her, to abandon his humanity and embrace something wholly other. And more than that, she was revealing her own desperation, her own need that had driven her to this drastic action. She had bitten him not out of hunger or malice, but out of hope. Hope that he would survive, that he would prove compatible, that he might finally end her centuries of solitude. Thomas became aware of his own breathing, rapid and shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Venom's effects were intensifying, bringing with them a rush of sensation that was almost euphoric. He could feel the forest around them, sense the flow of life through the bioluminescent plants, perceive the subtle currents of power that made this place more than just an ordinary woodland. And beneath it all, he could feel her presence like a second sun, burning with dark radiance, pulling at something deep in his transformed biology. "I don't even know your name," he said, the words coming out almost as a laugh, hysteria bubbling up at the absurdity of the situation. "You've bitten me, transformed me, claimed me as your mate, and I don't know what to call you." She pulled back slightly, enough to look into his eyes again, and this time her smile was genuine, warm, almost human. "I have had many names over the centuries," she said. "But the one I was born with, the one my mother gave me in a small village that no longer exists, was Ekaterina. You may call me Kate." "Kate," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It seemed too ordinary, too modern for this being of legend and nightmare. But there was something in the way she responded to it, a slight softening of her features, that suggested it meant something to her, connected her to memories of her lost humanity. "And now that we are properly introduced," Kate continued, a hint of amusement in her voice, "you must decide, Thomas Graves. Will you accept the bond? Will you take your place beside me and embrace what you are becoming? Or will you walk away and face the consequences of bearing my venom without my guidance?" She dropped her hands from his face but didn't step back, maintaining the intimate distance between them. Her wings spread slightly, catching the ambient ruby light, creating shadows that danced across both their bodies. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer, the bioluminescent plants dimming as if in anticipation. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, trying to see past the supernatural beauty and predatory grace to the being underneath. What he found surprised him. Yes, there was danger there, centuries of accumulated power and the capacity for violence that came with being an apex predator. But there was also loneliness, a desperate hunger not for blood but for connection, for someone who could understand the burden of her existence. She had been alone for so long, had survived horrors he couldn't imagine, had maintained her sanity and purpose through sheer force of will. And now she was offering to share that burden, to bring him into her world not as a victim or servant, but as an equal. His old life seemed to telescope away, becoming smaller and less significant with each passing moment. What did he have to return to? An empty apartment in a city that had never felt like home. No family, his parents were long dead and he'd been an only child. No career. His academic reputation was in ruins, his research dismissed as pseudoscience. No relationships. The divorce had effectively isolated him from his former social circle, and he'd been too absorbed in his work to build new connections. He'd been slowly dying long before Kate had sunk her fangs into his neck, drowning in mediocrity and failure, watching his dreams crumble into dust. But here, in this moment, with venom singing in his blood and an impossible being offering him a purpose, he felt more alive than he had in years. The transformation was terrifying, yes, but it was also exhilarating. He could feel power coiling in his muscles, sense capabilities he'd never possessed, perceive the world with a clarity that made his previous existence seem like living in a fog. And beneath the fear and confusion, there was something else, a pull toward her that felt like recognition, like two pieces of a puzzle finally finding their match. Maybe it was the venom influencing his decision. Maybe it was the loneliness in her eyes calling to the loneliness in his own heart. Maybe it was simple madness, the rational part of his mind breaking under the weight of impossible reality. Or maybe, just maybe, this was what he'd been searching for all along. Proof that there was more to existence than the mundane world acknowledged, that magic and wonder still existed in the forgotten corners of the earth, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to embrace it. "Tell me about the child," Thomas heard himself say, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "You said I could give you a child. How is that possible?" Kate's eyes widened slightly, and he realized he'd surprised her, that she'd expected a different response, either immediate acceptance or terrified rejection. She studied him for a long moment, seeming to recalibrate her approach, and when she spoke again, there was a new note of hope in her voice. "Vampires are not undead," she began, her tone taking on a lecturing quality, as if she were explaining a complex scientific principle. "That is a myth born of ignorance and fear. We are transformed, evolved into something that no longer requires the same biological processes as humans, but we retain many fundamental functions. Female vampires can conceive, but only with a mate who has been bonded through venom exchange, someone whose biology has been altered to become compatible with ours. It is excessively rare. Most vampires mate with others of their kind, and even then, conception occurs perhaps once in a century of trying. But you are something unique. Neither human nor vampire, but a perfect synthesis of both. The venom has rewritten your DNA to complement mine, making conception not just possible but likely." She placed a hand over her own abdomen, a gesture that was startlingly maternal coming from this lethal creature. "I have wanted a child for centuries, Thomas. Not for vanity or legacy, but because I remember what it was like to be human, to be part of a family, to nurture life rather than simply take it. A child would anchor me, give me something to protect beyond just myself, provide a reason to engage with the world rather than simply exist in isolation. And a child born of our union would be something entirely new, carrying both vampire and human traits, capable of bridging both worlds in ways neither of us can fully predict." Thomas felt a strange stirring at her words, something that might have been paternal instinct waking from long dormancy. He'd never seriously considered fatherhood. His marriage had been too unstable, his career too uncertain, his life too chaotic. But the idea of bringing something new into existence, something unique that had never existed before, appealed to the researcher in him, the part that had always been driven by discovery and innovation. "And if I say yes," he asked carefully, "if I accept the bond and stay with you, what happens? What does being your mate actually entail?" A complex expression crossed Kate's face, relief mixed with trepidation, desire tempered with uncertainty. She was powerful beyond measure, had survived centuries of solitude, but in this moment she seemed almost vulnerable, afraid of saying the wrong thing and driving him away. "The bond must be completed," she said, her voice taking on a formal quality as if reciting ancient ritual. "You have survived my venom, that is the first test. But to truly become my mate, to stabilize your transformation and prevent the madness that would eventually consume you without proper guidance, we must exchange blood in the old way. You must drink from me as I have drunk from you, mingling our essences until your biology fully synchronizes with mine. It is intimate. More intimate than human sexuality, though that is part of it. When vampires bond, we merge not just physically but psychically, creating a connection that transcends normal relationship boundaries. You would be able to sense my emotions, locate me across great distances, draw upon my strength in times of need. And I would have the same access to you." She paused, making sure he understood the gravity of what she was describing. "It is not mind reading exactly, but something close to it. There would be very little privacy between us, especially in the early years while the bond settles. You would feel my hunger, my pleasure, my pain. And I would feel yours. We would become, in some fundamental way, two parts of a single whole." The prospect was both terrifying and intoxicating. To be known so completely, to have someone else's consciousness intertwined with his own, violated every instinct of self-preservation. But it also promised an end to loneliness more complete than he'd ever imagined possible, a connection that would make his failed marriage seem like a superficial acquaintance by comparison. "And after the bond?" he pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what he was considering. "What would our life be like? Would I be trapped in this forest forever? What about the rest of the world?" Kate's expression softened, and she gestured toward the glowing forest around them. "This is my sanctuary, yes, but not a prison. As my mate, you would share my power, gain abilities that would make the human world seem small and limiting. We could travel anywhere darkness falls, explore places humans can never reach, witness wonders that no camera could capture. I could teach you things, the true history of the world, knowledge accumulated over centuries, secrets of power that have been forgotten or suppressed. Together we would be formidable, capable of influencing events, protecting innocent humans from the darker things that prey upon them, maintaining the balance between the mundane and the magical. She moved closer again, her hand returning to his face, fingers threading through his hair with surprising gentleness. But I will not lie to you, Thomas. It would not be an easy existence. You would need to feed, not on human blood, at least not fatally, but the venom requires sustenance. You would age slowly, watching the human world change around you while remaining apart from it. You would be forever between worlds, belonging fully to neither, able to walk in daylight, which I cannot, but marked by darkness nonetheless. And you would be bound to me for as long as we both exist, unable to form the same depth of connection with another as you would have with me. She leaned her forehead against his, her eyes closing briefly, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I am asking you to give up your humanity, Thomas Graves. To abandon the life you knew and step into legend. It is not a fair request. But I am 743 years old, and I am so very tired of being alone. The raw honesty in her admission broke something inside him, some last wall of resistance. He'd spent years chasing myths and legends, seeking proof of the supernatural, driven by a need to believe that there was more to existence than the prosaic reality of modern life. And now that proof stood before him, not just offering evidence of the impossible but inviting him to become part of it, to live the very mysteries he dedicated his life to studying. His hand rose of its own volition, covering hers where it rested against his face. Her skin was cool to the touch but not unpleasantly so, like marble that had been kept in shade. He could feel the subtle vibration of power beneath her flesh, the controlled energy that animated her undead existence. When his fingers interlaced with hers, something clicked into place, a sensation like two magnetic fields aligning, and he felt a jolt of connection that made his breath catch. I'm afraid, he admitted, the words coming easier than he'd expected. I'm terrified, actually. Everything you're describing sounds like madness, like I'm having a psychotic break and hallucinating all of this. But I'm also more certain than I've ever been about anything that this is real, that you're real, that this moment is the most important decision of my life. Kate opened her eyes, those crimson orbs meeting his gaze with an intensity that seemed to peer into his soul. Fear is appropriate, she said. Fear means you understand the magnitude of what is happening. Only a fool would face this without fear. The question is whether your curiosity, your need for purpose, your desire for something more than the half-life you've been living, is stronger than your fear. Thomas thought about his apartment, empty except for boxes of research materials and obsolete equipment. He thought about the university office he'd been escorted from, his colleagues' pitying looks as security packed his belongings. He thought about his ex-wife's final words, "You're chasing ghosts, Tom. And you're disappearing while you do it." She'd been right in a way. He had been disappearing, fading into irrelevance, becoming a ghost in his own life. But now, paradoxically, by accepting his transformation into something inhuman, he had the chance to become more real, more present, more alive than he'd ever been. Teach me, he said finally, the words emerging with surprising firmness. Show me how to complete the bond. I choose this. I choose you. I choose to become something more than what I was. The transformation in Kate's expression was immediate and profound. The predatory mask she'd been wearing dropped away, revealing joy so pure and intense that it almost hurt to witness. She had been prepared for rejection, had armored herself against the possibility that he would refuse, and his acceptance seemed to catch her completely off guard. For a moment, she looked exactly like what she'd once been, a young woman experiencing happiness for the first time in centuries, vulnerable and luminous with hope. Then she was moving, her arms encircling him, pulling him close with strength that should have crushed bones but was carefully controlled to merely embrace. Her wings swept forward, cocooning them completely, shutting out the forest and the world beyond. In the sudden intimacy of that enclosed space, with her body pressed against his and her face buried against his neck, right over the bite marks she'd left, Thomas felt the final barriers between them dissolve. Thank you, she whispered against his skin, and he could feel moisture there, cool tears tracking down his neck. A vampire crying. The impossibility of it made his own eyes burn in sympathetic response. Thank you for not making me wait another 7 centuries. Thank you for being brave enough or foolish enough to say yes. Thomas held her, this ancient creature who was somehow also a lonely woman, and felt the rightness of the moment settle into his bones. The venom in his blood seemed to surge in response to their proximity, recognizing its source, reaching toward her like a plant growing toward light. His enhanced senses detected the subtle changes in her body, her heartbeat accelerating from its usual slow pace, her skin warming slightly where they touched, pheromones releasing that called to something primal in his transformed biology. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his hands moving of their own accord, sliding up her back, careful not to disturb the base of her wings where they connected to her shoulder blades. The armor she wore felt organic under his touch, shifting slightly to accommodate his exploration, as if it were part of her rather than something she'd put on. Kate pulled back just far enough to look at him, her hands framing his face again, thumbs brushing away tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. "The ritual is simple but profound," she said, her voice taking on that formal tone again. "We must exchange blood while in a state of connection. The bond is formed through the mingling of essences, sealed through the joining of bodies. It will be intense, Thomas. Overwhelming. You will feel everything I feel, experience sensations no human was meant to experience. It may frighten you. It will certainly change you in ways beyond the physical transformation the venom has already wrought." "I understand," he said, though he suspected he didn't, not really. How could he possibly understand something so far outside normal human experience? She searched his eyes for a long moment, then nodded, seeming to find whatever assurance she needed. Her hands slid from his face down to his chest, fingers finding the buttons of his shirt with surprising delicacy considering the lethal nails that tipped them. As she began undoing them, one by one, the reality of what they were about to do fully struck him. This was happening. He was about to consummate a bond with a vampire queen in the middle of a haunted forest, fundamentally altering his existence in ways he couldn't fully predict or control. His scientist's brain, that objective observer that had remained somewhat detached even through the terror and transformation, finally surrendered. There was no controlling this situation, no analyzing or rationalizing his way through it. He could only experience it, surrender to it, and hope that the man who emerged on the other side was still recognizably himself. Kate pushed his shirt from his shoulders, letting it fall to the forest floor, which exhaled a puff of luminous spores at the disturbance. Her hands explored his chest with obvious appreciation, tracing the lines of muscle and bone, mapping territory she was claiming as her own. Her touch left trails of tingling sensation, the venom in his blood responding to her proximity with increasing intensity. "You are beautiful," she murmured, her voice dropping into a register that vibrated through his sternum. "Human, yes, but transforming into something more. I can see the venom working, restructuring you at the cellular level. By this time tomorrow you will be stronger, faster, more durable. In a week you will barely remember what it felt like to be fully human. In a month you will wonder how you ever tolerated such limitations." Her hands moved to her own armor, and Thomas watched in fascination as it seemed to peel away of its own accord, responding to her will. The black material liquefied and flowed, retracting from her torso and dissolving into nothingness, revealing pale luminous skin beneath. Her body was a masterwork of feminine power, full breasts, narrow waist, the subtle definition of muscle beneath smooth skin. She was both sculpture and living being, beautiful in a way that transcended mere aesthetic appeal and entered the realm of the numinous. Thomas reached for her, his hands trembling slightly as they made contact with her bare skin. She was cooler than a human woman would be, but not uncomfortably so, her body temperature reflecting her altered metabolism. Under his palms, he could feel the slow, steady beat of her heart, that inhuman rhythm that pulsed once every 5 seconds, patient and eternal. Her skin was impossibly smooth, unmarred by blemish or scar, as if her body had been perfected by centuries of vampiric existence. Kate's hands went to his belt, and within moments she had divested him of the remainder of his clothing, moving with supernatural speed and grace that left him dizzy. Then they were skin to skin, the coolness of her body a pleasant contrast to his own feverish heat, the venom-induced transformation making his temperature run higher than normal. Her arms wrapped around him again, and she guided them down to the forest floor, which seemed to soften beneath them, the bioluminescent moss creating a bed that pulsed with ruby light. She straddled him, her wings spreading wide above them like a canopy, and for a moment she simply looked at him, drinking in the sight with eyes that glowed like embers. "Are you ready, Thomas Graves?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with power. "Once we begin, there is no stopping until the bond is complete. You will be mine, and I will be yours, bound by blood and venom for as long as we both shall exist." "I'm ready," he said, and meant it, fear and anticipation twining together into something that felt like destiny. Kate leaned down, her lips finding his in a kiss that was surprisingly gentle despite the fangs. Her mouth tasted of copper and something else, something dark and sweet that might have been old wine or ancient blood. As they kissed, he felt her fangs graze his lower lip, breaking the skin, and she pulled back with a soft gasp. "Your blood," she whispered, her eyes widening. "It's already changing. I can taste the venom, the transformation. You're accepting it completely, not fighting it. Oh, Thomas, do you know how rare that is? Most humans resist the change and it kills them or drives them mad. But you're embracing it, letting it remake you." She looked almost awestruck, and he realized she hadn't truly believed he would survive until this moment, when she could taste the proof of his transformation on her tongue. Then she was moving, her body joining with his in a motion that was both intensely physical and something more, something that seemed to happen on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. Thomas gasped at the sensation, his hands gripping her hips, feeling the play of muscle beneath silk-smooth skin. The pleasure was immediate and overwhelming, his transformed nervous system amplifying every sensation to nearly unbearable intensity. But that was just the beginning. As their bodies moved together, finding a rhythm that seemed choreographed by instinct, Kate brought her wrist to her mouth and bit down, her fangs piercing her own flesh. Dark blood welled from the wound, not the bright red of human blood but something richer, almost black, threaded through with veins of crimson light that pulsed with power. "Drink," she commanded, offering her bleeding wrist to his mouth. "Take my essence into yourself and complete the bond." Thomas hesitated for only a heartbeat before pressing his lips to the wound. The taste that flooded his mouth was indescribable, copper and iron, yes, but also something like cinnamon and smoke, power and darkness concentrated into liquid form. It burned going down, a pleasant fire that spread from his throat through his chest and into his limbs. He could feel it mixing with the venom already in his system, creating a reaction that was almost alchemical, fundamentally altering his biology in ways that went beyond the initial transformation. And then the bond snapped into place and Thomas's mind exploded outward, suddenly perceiving not just his own consciousness but hers as well. He felt her pleasure, her relief, her joy, her desperate hope that this would work, that he wouldn't reject her even now. He experienced 7 centuries of loneliness compressed into a single devastating moment, understood the weight of existence that she'd carried alone for so long. He saw glimpses of her past, a small village, a young woman with hope in her eyes, an attack in darkness, transformation and horror, the first time she'd killed, the century that followed as she learned to control her hunger and power, the slow accumulation of years into decades into centuries until time itself became almost meaningless. At the same time she was experiencing him, his childhood, his failed marriage, his slow surrender to despair and obscurity, his desperate need to believe in something beyond the mundane world. She felt his fear and his courage, his grief and his hope, his capacity for love that had been dormant for so long it had almost atrophied. She saw the man beneath the surface, the person he'd wanted to be but had never had the opportunity to become, and in her mind he felt her acceptance, her embrace of every flaw and failure that made him human. The physical pleasure and the psychic connection amplified each other, creating a feedback loop that spiraled toward something that was more than orgasm, more than mere ecstasy. Thomas felt himself dissolving, his identity merging with hers, boundaries becoming meaningless as they truly became 2 parts of a single being. He was Thomas and Kate, male and female, human and vampire, 700 years of loneliness and 32 years of disappointment, ending simultaneously in this moment of absolute union. The forest exploded around them, every bioluminescent plant flaring to maximum brightness at once, responding to the surge of power being generated by the bond. Ruby light became a solid wall, illuminating the clearing like daylight, and Thomas heard Kate cry out, her voice echoing through the trees, carrying triumph and relief and pure unadulterated joy. Her wings beat once, twice, lifting them momentarily off the ground, suspended in space as the bond completed and locked into place. Then they were collapsing back to the moss, gasping, shaking, clutching each other as the intensity gradually receded to something more manageable. Thomas could still feel her in his mind, her presence like a second heartbeat, but the overwhelming tsunami of shared sensation had passed, leaving behind a connection that was constant but controllable. He could sense her emotions, satisfaction, contentment, exhausted happiness, but they were distinct from his own, two separate melodies harmonizing rather than a single confused noise. Kate rolled off him, settling beside him on the luminous moss, her wings folding back against her shoulder blades. She was smiling, a genuine expression of joy that transformed her already beautiful face into something almost divine. Her hand found his, fingers interlacing, and he felt the bond pulse with contentment at the contact. "It is done," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of finality. "You are mine and I am yours. The bond is complete and will endure until death or deliberate severance, neither of which I intend to permit." She turned her head to look at him, those crimson eyes soft with affection. "How do you feel, my mate?" Thomas took stock of himself, amazed that he could even think coherently after what he'd just experienced. His body felt different, stronger, more coordinated, humming with energy that had nothing to do with adrenaline. His senses were even sharper than before, every detail of the forest crisp and clear despite the darkness. And in his mind, there was now this new presence, this awareness of Kate that went beyond normal perception. He could sense her location relative to himself, feel the contentment radiating from her, even catch wisps of her thoughts when she wasn't actively shielding them. "I feel," he searched for words adequate to describe the experience and came up short. "Complete. Like I've been missing something my entire life and only just now realized what it was." "Is that normal?" Kate's smile widened. "For a successful bond?" "Yes. We are meant to be together, Thomas. The bond would not have formed otherwise. You were correct. I could not simply decide you would be my mate. The universe, or fate, or whatever power governs these things, had to approve. The fact that you survived the venom, that the bond formed cleanly without rejection or madness, proves that we are compatible on every level. Physically, psychologically, spiritually, we fit." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with an expression that mingled possession with genuine affection. "And now you are truly vampire kin, no longer human but not quite vampire either. You will need to feed soon. The transformation and bonding have depleted your reserves. But unlike me, you can consume normal food as well as blood. You will age, but slowly, perhaps 1 year for every 10 that pass. Sunlight will not harm you, though you will find yourself preferring twilight and darkness. Silver has no power over you, and crosses and holy water are merely symbols with no inherent threat. You are, in every way, perfectly designed to be my partner in this existence." Thomas processed this information with a detached part of his mind that was still trying to function scientifically. He was a new species essentially. A hybrid that had never existed before, carrying traits of both vampire and human. The researcher in him wanted to document everything, to study the changes and catalog the abilities. But that impulse was balanced now by another awareness, of Kate beside him, of the bond thrumming between them, of the forest surrounding them and the night stretching ahead. "What happens now?" he asked, the question encompassing not just the immediate moment but the entirety of their bonded future. Kate leaned down and kissed him, gentle and sweet, her fangs carefully retracted. When she pulled back, her eyes were dancing with possibilities. Now we have eternity to figure that out. But for tonight we rest. Tomorrow I will teach you to hunt, to feed without killing, to control the power that flows through your transformed body. In the coming weeks I will show you my world, the hidden places where magic still thrives, the old powers that lurk in shadows, the other supernatural beings who have learned to coexist with humanity's dominance. And in time perhaps." She placed a hand over her abdomen again, that maternal gesture he'd noticed before. "In time we will see if the bond has granted me what I have desired for so long. A child. A legacy. A reason to build something that extends beyond mere survival." The possibility settled into Thomas's mind, and he found himself reaching out, covering her hand with his own, feeling the coolness of her flesh beneath his palm. A child. His child. Their child. Something that would be as unique as he now was, carrying the bloodlines of human and vampire, embodying possibilities that no one could predict. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I never thought I'd be a father, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I never thought I'd be anything really. Just a failed researcher chasing stories no one believed. But now you are the story, Kate finished, her smile softening. And together we will write chapters that have never been imagined. You wanted proof of the supernatural, Thomas Graves. You sought evidence of magic in the world. And now you are that evidence. You are the bridge between worlds, the living proof that there is more to existence than the mundane reality humanity accepts. She stood, pulling him up with her, and her armor flowed back into existence, covering her body in its organic embrace. The wings stretched and folded, and she looked every inch the vampire queen again, powerful and ancient and utterly magnificent. But when she looked at him, there was warmth in those crimson eyes, a softness reserved only for him. Come, she said, extending her hand. Let me show you your new home. Thomas took her hand, feeling the bond pulse with approval at the contact, and let her lead him deeper into the forest. As they walked, the bioluminescent plants seemed to light their path, responding to Kate's presence, acknowledging her dominion over this place. He could sense other creatures in the darkness, animals both mundane and strange, drawn to the power she emanated but kept at bay by her will. They emerged into a clearing where a structure rose from the forest floor, something that looked like it had been grown rather than built. It was part tree, part building, organic architecture that melded seamlessly with the surrounding woodland. Walls of living wood formed rooms and corridors, while a roof of interwoven branches kept out the weather. Bioluminescent moss carpeted the floor, providing soft ruby light, and furniture that seemed carved from single pieces of wood furnished the space. This is my sanctuary, Kate explained, gesturing to encompass the structure. I have lived here for 3 centuries since I claimed this forest as my territory. It responds to my will, grows and changes as I need. And now it is your home as well. It will recognize you, protect you, provide for you as it does for me. Thomas stepped inside, feeling the subtle awareness of the structure around him, as if the building itself was alive and taking his measure. He could sense its acceptance, the way it acknowledged his bond with Kate and extended that recognition to him. A doorway opened in the far wall, revealing a chamber that looked like it had just been created, furnished simply but comfortably, clearly intended as his personal space. I thought you might want somewhere that is yours alone, Kate said, following his gaze. The bond is strong, but even mates need solitude sometimes. This room will be your refuge when you need distance. I will not enter without invitation. The consideration in the gesture touched him deeply. She was powerful beyond measure, could have claimed complete control over him, but instead she was ensuring he maintained autonomy. It spoke to the kind of mate she intended to be, possessive, yes, but not controlling. Connected, but not consuming. Thank you, he said, meaning it profoundly. For all of this. For choosing me, for trusting me with your loneliness, for giving me a purpose when I'd lost mine. Kate moved to him, her arms encircling his waist, her head resting against his chest. Despite the coolness of her body, the embrace felt warm, comforting, right? Thank you for surviving, she whispered. Thank you for being brave enough to say yes. Thank you for ending my solitude. They stood like that for long minutes, the bond between them pulsing steadily, 2 beings who had been incomplete now forming a whole. Outside, the forest continued its bioluminescent display, ruby light painting the world in shades of magic and mystery. And somewhere in the distance, Thomas could hear the sounds of the night, animals moving through undergrowth, wind sighing through branches, the subtle chorus of a wilderness that was now his home. His old life was gone, irrevocably left behind. Thomas Graves, the failed researcher, the divorced academic, the man slowly disappearing into obscurity, that person was dead, killed by vampire venom and rebirth through blood and bond. But someone new had emerged to take his place, someone with purpose and power, someone who had found belonging in the most impossible of circumstances. He was vampirekin now, mate to an ancient queen, guardian of a magical forest, father-to-be of something entirely new. The future stretched ahead, vast and unknown, filled with dangers he couldn't predict and wonders he could barely imagine. But he wouldn't face it alone. Kate was with him, bound to him, as committed to their partnership as he was coming to be. The venom in his blood sang with contentment, recognizing its source and destination, understanding that he had found exactly where he belonged. And in his mind, through the bond, he could feel Kate's matching satisfaction, her joy at finally having someone to share her existence with, her hope for what they might build together. "What do we do now?" he asked again, the question taking on new meaning in this moment of domesticity after the intensity of the bonding. Kate pulled back, looking up at him with a mischievous smile that made her look suddenly much younger than her centuries. Now I teach you the first and most important lesson of your new existence." She took his hand and led him toward another chamber, where a bed of moss and silk waited in the ruby-lit dimness. "We rest, we recover, and we enjoy the fact that we are no longer alone. The rest, the hunting, the training, the grand adventures, can wait for tomorrow. Tonight is ours." She pulled him down into the softness, her wings creating a canopy over them both, shutting out the world. Her body pressed against his, cool and perfect, and through the bond he felt her contentment, her relief, her determination to simply be with him in this moment without thought for past or future. Thomas wrapped his arms around her, feeling the rightness of it settle into his bones. Tomorrow would bring challenges, he knew. He would need to learn to control his new abilities, to navigate the supernatural world he'd been inducted into, to figure out what being vampire-kin truly meant. There would be difficulties and dangers, tests of his resolve and his transformed nature. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight, he had Kate in his arms, the bond thrumming steadily between them, and the certain knowledge that he had found what he'd been searching for his entire life, proof of magic, purpose in darkness, and someone who had chosen him not despite his flaws but because of who he fundamentally was. In the forest outside, the bioluminescent plants pulsed in gentle rhythm, celebrating the completion of the bond, acknowledging the birth of something new. And as Thomas drifted toward sleep, his consciousness still intertwined with Kate's, he smiled into the darkness, understanding at last that sometimes the greatest discoveries came not from seeking answers, but from being brave enough to become the answer yourself. The vampire queen and her bonded mate rested in the heart of the red forest, their entwined forms creating shadows in the ruby light, their joined existence a promise of things to come. The night embraced them, the forest protected them, and the bond between them grew stronger with each shared heartbeat. Somewhere in that twilight space between waking and dreaming, Thomas Graves ceased to exist, and someone entirely new took his place. Someone with a mate, a purpose, and an eternity of possibilities stretching ahead. And in the morning, when he woke to find Kate watching him with those luminous crimson eyes, her smile soft with affection and her hand resting possessively over his heart, he would not regret the choice that brought him here. He would face his new existence with courage, curiosity, and the certain knowledge that he had finally, against all odds, found exactly where he belonged. The Venom bond was complete. The story had just begun. And in the depths of the red forest, two souls entwined by blood and destiny prepared to face eternity together, partners in darkness, guardians of magic, and proof that love could bloom even in the most impossible of circumstances.